Welcome, everyone. My name is Patrick McGuigan. I'm a food writer and journalist. I write specifically about cheese, newspapers and magazines, and had a book published a couple of years ago called The Philosophy of Cheese. You've tuned in to one of many talks that have been going on today for Food Diversity Day. We're focusing on cheese, called The Last of Their Kind, which all sounds a bit ominous. But there is quite a lot of positivity actually around this story as well. I'm sure you've tuned into some of the other talks, but just what is Food Diversity Day quickly? It's a day, today we've had a series of online talks all about how our food systems around the world and in the UK are becoming more and more condensed and homogenized, which is quite a good word if we're talking about milk and cheese. And this has all come from a book by Dan Salabino called Eating to Extinction, which is a brilliant book looking at how our food has become less and less diverse and the issues that can bring and why actually we need diversity in our diets. We're focusing on cheese. We've got a room full of some of the best people in Britain. We're still waiting on one more to join us. So we've got brilliant cheesemakers and cheesemongers. We've got Andy Swinscoe from the Courtyard Dairy, a fabulous cheesemonger in Yorkshire, in Settle. We have David and William Clarke from Sparkenhoe Farm. They're famous for making Sparkenhoe Red Leicester, amongst many other fantastic cheeses. And Sally Hattan from Stonebeck Cheese, also in Yorkshire, in Nidderdale, who makes Stonebeck Wensleydale. And hopefully Graham Kirkham from Kirkham, Lancashire, will be joining us. We're gonna get sort of into it very quickly and bring everyone else in rather than listening to me. But one of the things I thought would be quite useful before we start is I'll give you 100 years of cheese history in about 3 minutes, just to explain sort of where we've come from and where we are now in terms of our diversity and how many cheesemakers and how many cheeses we have and all that sort of thing. It would be great if people want to send questions as we go along on the chat, and we can answer those at the end. And once we get going, there's going to be, we'll have a real discussion. Right, let's take you back to just before the First World War. 3,500 farmhouse cheesemakers, small cheesemakers using their own milk on their farm to make cheese in the UK. 3,500. By the end of the Second World War, there was less than 100. You look at the 20th century, certainly that first half, there was a complete wipeout of what we call farmhouse cheesemakers, people making cheese on their own farm with their own milk for various reasons, which we'll get into, I'm sure, but 2 world wars didn't help. Milk Marketing Board setting the price of milk at quite a high level so people stopped making cheese. Rationing, where only certain cheeses were allowed to be made. Lancashire was not one of those, for example. Neither was Gloucester, single Gloucester or double Gloucester. And then we had the rise of the supermarkets and industrialisation. So if you look at the cheese market today, if we look back 100 years, we have 3,500 farmhouse cheesemakers. We've probably got a couple of hundred maximum. The Specialist Cheesemakers Association has about 200 members. I don't know how many of those are actually farm-based and those are buying in milk, but it's a small number. And if you look at the supermarkets where most people buy their cheese, it's all block cheese made in big creamery. So really, most of the cheese, 99% of the cheese that's eaten in this country, made in factories or big creameries, block versions of traditional cheeses, block cheddar, block Wensleydale, block Red Leicester, and so on. So here we are, and it's, the argument, I suppose, for food diversity is an interesting one. And Andy, I'd quite like to bring you in on this because you sell dozens of amazing artisan farmhouse cheeses in your cheese shop. my first question that I'm quite interested in, and then we can talk to the cheesemakers, is actually do we need lots of farmhouse cheese? What's wrong with having lots of block Cheddar and block Wensleydale and block Red Leicester? It's cheap, cost of living prices. What's the problem? Why do we need diversity amongst our cheeses and cheesemakers?
It's a great question, Patrick. And and we'll go on and talk to Sally a bit in a minute about Wensleydale and particularly Stonebeck cheese, which is I think a great focus. And if you look at a particular cheese, mainly, don't get me wrong, I'm in Yorkshire and we're based up in Yorkshire and we have a big focus towards that. But it kind of showcases for me putting a magnifying glass on farm cheese. For 1,000 years, we had farmhouse cheese made in Wensleydale, made on individual family farms throughout the Dales, all making a reflection of that one place. So I always compare it. Imagine if I gave each person watching a sponge cake recipe, the same ingredients, the same time, and the same equipment, you get 150 sponge cakes. But on a farmhouse cheese level, you amplify that up because they have different pasture, they have different ways of breeding their cows, of feeding their cows, they have different microclimates and different equipment. So when you make cheese on a farm level, you make a real reflection of that one place. And for me, that's a special little thing. When you make cheese on a factory level, what you're trying to do is make a consistent, standardized, economically efficient cheese, which has its place in the world. But what I'm looking for is something that has a unique reflection of that little place. So that when you come up and visit the Yorkshire Dales, or when you come up, go to Leicester and go to Leicestershire, you taste a product of that place and it belongs to that place. I always compare it to when you go abroad to France and you go to the Savoie region and you taste the best Toms you've ever tasted, and you never quite taste it like that ever again. And for me, that's part of being in that place. And when you make a farm cheese, you can make a real reflection of not just that place, but that individual little family farm. And I think that is worth championing for lots of reasons, which I'm more than happy to elaborate on. But the first thing is you will capture flavour of one little individual place that can't be replicated, that belongs to that place. It's not a standardized, consistent product. And I think that's a positive thing.
And what so interesting flavors, different flavors, a wider range of eating experiences. So that's one reason. Are there other benefits to having diversity? I mean, I was thinking about sort of economics, culture, social history. All of these things seem to me quite important things that are encapsulated in cheese.
Yeah, I think that cheese. Britain's cheese is famous across the world. Cheddar, Leicester, Gloucester, Stilton, those cheese names are famous across the world. And they became famous because of the reputation of British cheese. I would suggest that the block industrial cheeses that have that reputation nowadays, that are sold mainly nowadays, are fairly nice cheeses, but they're not these, what they used to call Epicurean delights. They're not these amazing cheeses that kind of built that reputation. And not only is it about flavour, but, when you look at it, you talk to people like Kirkham. Kirkham has nigh on 80 cows and supports probably about 10 households, when you look at the amount of people that he employs, his mum and his dad and his sisters and his brothers, and the whole economy is vibrant because of it. If he was just milking cows and sending that milk away, it would just be probably 2 people. So there's a good argument for keeping the rural economy vibrant. There's also a good argument for giving your town an identity. Market Bosworth, where David and William are going to talk about in a minute, their cheese, that isn't just Market Bosworth anymore. That's Market Bosworth where Sparkenhoe is made. That food product has given their village an identity, so it gives people a reason to visit the village, which then increases the economics. Another great reason for supporting farmhouse cheese, in my opinion, is I'm a big advocate of native breeds of cows, of traditional grasses, or farming in a more biodiverse way. I'm not going to lie to you, it's more expensive to farm like that. So we're in an economy of cheap food, and you cannot sell liquid milk and farm with a native breed of cow on traditional grasses that are cut later. The great thing about cheese is it's a win-win situation. So if you do those processes, yes, it costs more to produce. And you can ask the cost of production for somebody like Sally Hattan on a litre of milk. She couldn't keep her farm going if she had to sell milk. Neither could Kirkham, because it costs them that much to produce that litre of milk. but that's because it adds so much flavor. So not only is it better for the environment and more socially, economically, attainable in terms of, sustainable farming. But my argument is if we want to farm sustainably, it has to make economic sense. We're not just trying to preserve museums of history of old-fashioned cheesemaking. There has to be an economic reason. And the great thing about cheesemaking is it's a win-win. Farming like that improves flavor in your cheese. So it actually makes sense to farm like that on an economic level, not just on a sustainable let's box tick and greenwash level. It's actually, it makes sense all around. For me, that is a key part of it, in terms of not just, you want those diversity of farming methods and you want those diversity of breeds of cows and those traditional grasses that are better for the environment and biodiversity and wildlife. And to do that, you have to make a product which can justify that. And cheese can.
And I think it'd be quite good to bring in the Clarks, actually, because you mentioned Sparkenhoe Farm. I think we've got, I think Kirkham's are joining now as well. Let's bring in the Clark. So, I think it's quite good to get some stories as well around sort of, I was looking up at the history of Red Leicester, and it looked like from the 1950s, there was literally no Red Leicester being made on a farm in Leicestershire, from what I could see. The cheese had completely died out as a farmhouse product. But Sparkenhoe Red Leicester is with us and has been with us, 20 odd years now? Is that right, David?
2005 we started making it, and at that point Red Leicester hadn't been made on a farm in Leicestershire for about 50 years at that point. So yes, and it hasn't been made at all in the county for about 18, we think. So it's gone.
So how do you resurrect? You would call all of these cheeses, if people aren't familiar, sort of territorials. They're called in the business, aren't they? So you've got your Wensleydale, your Lancashire, Red Leicester, Caerphilly, linked to a particular place. How do you resurrect a territorial when it's not been made for 20 years on a farm?
A bit of blind faith, a lot of studying, and yes, and a lot of tweaking of recipes. And I think what we first started making was nowhere near as good as what we're making now, or at least I hope we've improved it over the years. So yes, and ladies came when we started selling cheese at farmers markets. Several ladies came to us with old handwritten recipes that their mother or grandmother used to make Red Leicester cheese, and they very kindly gave us these recipes. And our recipe now, they were all different, but our recipe is a sort of amalgamation of those and how we were taught to make cheese when we first learned.
So I mean, this is called the last of their kind. You still are, am I right in saying you're still the only raw milk farmhouse Red Leicester producer in the traditional area?
We are. We're the only people that produce it on a farm. Yes, I think the word farmhouse is probably one of the most abused words within the cheese industry. But yes, farmhouse as in quite large production sometimes.
You're on a farm using your unpasteurised milk. Yes. So, I mean, because I've written loads over the years around the British cheese revolution and how exciting it is that British cheese has bounced back and we're doing so well, but we still only have one Red Leicester being made in Leicestershire in a traditional way.
Well, it's quite a difficult thing to do. When we thought about doing lots of different things before we started to make cheese, and I think the thing we chose, making cheese, was the most difficult thing to do. It is the most rewarding, and we love doing it. But as Graham and I always say to each other when we see each other, not bought yourself a helicopter yet. Then it's it's never going to make us millionaires, and I think, but it is a very rewarding thing to do.
And I wondered, in the time that you've said, what we're talking, sort of 17, 18 years of making the cheese, how has the cheese changed, but how has your approach to farming changed? And what are you doing now? Because we're talking about traditional cheeses, but traditions change, don't they, and they develop, and you learn as you go along.
Yes, I think we've changed a lot. We produced milk at the least possible cost we could before, because we were producing it for the bulk market. We have a very holistic approach to how we farm and how we make cheese now. The whole thing, it's all connected. We've gone into regenerative farming. And I think to sum up what Andy was trying to say earlier on, variety is the spice of life. and so we apply that really to what we feed the cows as well now. It's what we feed the cows' diet is much more complex. We give them far more different types of forage, and it's all as much homegrown as possible and all that sort of thing. So yeah, so it's very exciting actually what's going on. There's a bit of a revolution going on in farming, and it's sort of a step back in lots of ways to how our grandfathers were farming, but with a better understanding of the biology and the science of it all, I think, without wanting to criticise how our grandfathers worked.
And Will, you've come into the business and you're sort of the next generation, are you? Sort of, when did you start? What's your role in the company?
I came back from university 6 years ago now and started making Sparkenhoe blue. I did agriculture at university, so it's not particularly food based, but I got pushed into a cheese shed and was told to make some make blue cheese, which is a lot trickier than you'd imagine. But no, we've started moving towards this more regenerative thing since I've come home, and it's now more of a buzzword in the farming community. So we're moving that way, and it's a much more fun way of farming. It's more interesting. You're not putting chemicals and sprays on the field. You're trying to manage it in a more conventional, more, as that's a holistic way that works with nature, really.
Can you give me, for people who don't know what regenerative farming means, and I've done lots of interviews around it and read, I'm still not sure what regenerative farming means, because it seems the definition seems to move around. But just some concrete examples of what you're doing on the farm that's different?
Our idea, it varies for everybody that's attempting it, but our idea is we're growing more herbal lays. So we've got chicory, burnet, ribgrass, lots of more clovers, lots of a wider variety of grasses in each of these lays as well, just so that the cows are being fed more proteins and the more diverse amount of proteins we've got in the feed, the more flavors we'll have within that curd as well. That's where the flavor comes from, and the diversity in flavor. So regeneratively wise, that's it. It's going to look after the ground. They're deeper rooting these herbs, so you shouldn't have to move the soil as much. The roots will do it for you. We've got more clovers fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere, so we don't have to feed synthetic bagged fertilizer. We don't have to put that on the field, sorry. And we're moving the soil less when we're working the ground. We're trying to build up organic matter into the soil, which will in turn feed the crop more nitrogen and should sink more carbon at the same time.
Okay, that's interesting. So, and that's actually a way of farming that 100 years ago, 150 years ago would have been fairly normal, would it? That would have been part of the course.
Well, with a subtle difference in that we don't plough. And that's where the big difference lies, because by not ploughing, we're hoping to build up the mycorrhizal fungal levels in the soil. Most soils have got too high bacteria and too lower fungal levels, and we need to correct that. So by not ploughing, we're not saying we will never plough, but we're trying to avoid it at all, as much as possible.
And just to finish up on Red Leicester, I mean, so you had people coming with recipes written on the back of envelopes and, telling you what you think your cheese should taste like. How did you do taste tests with people in the area that could remember how Red Leicester used? How do you know when you've actually got it how it used to be?
Well, we didn't actually do taste tests, but people would come to the farmers market and say, that's how I remember it as a child. And that's if people say that, we're really pleased. It's a nice thing to hear, because that's what we're aiming for, really. Yeah,
it's interesting, because it'd be nice to. Well, and Andy, I don't know if you please chip in if you've got thoughts. And I think it'd be quite nice to bring Graham in now, because in a way with Lancashire cheese, I was looking back. 1939 there were 200 Lancashire cheesemakers in the county of Lancashire, and now, Graham, you're the last one making a raw milk Lancashire cheese in the traditional manner on your own farm. But luckily you had your mum to pass on the recipe, and you didn't have to ask people at farmers market how to make your cheese. Graham, you're on mute.
We always argue that Graham's rarer than the white rhino because there's 2 white rhinos left in the world, but there's only 1 farm producer of Lancashire. Patrick, Graham, you're here.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Sorry we're late. Us and technology are a nightmare.
No,
For some reason it just wouldn't link. But anyway, we're here. So good evening, everybody. Sorry about that.
No, that's a pleasure. So what I'm sort of trying to get at is the knowledge wasn't lost for Lancashire. After the war, there were enough producers that the information about how to make this cheese on a traditional way was passed down the generations to you.
Yeah, well, so for us, you know, it was inevitable for me. There's cheese making on both sides of a family, you know. A small side on my dad's side, you know, his family made cheese, but in a very small way. But more on my mum's side. So it was my grandma, you know, my mum's mum, Mrs. Townley. She made cheese all of her life at a farm called Wynn House in Inglewhite, and she learnt that from when she was young from Chipping Dairy up in Chipping. So she's made it from a little girl. She retired in 1978. My grandma retired, and then she convinced my mum, as well as my dad, to start, because my mum didn't want to start making cheese at the start because she knows the commitment, like you all do, you know, and it is a lifestyle, this cheese making. So my dad and my grandma persuaded my mum to start making cheese, and that was back in 1978. They converted a little farm building outside. I mean, it's literally like your front room. Converted this little building right next to the farmhouse. My grandma came and showed my mum how to make cheese for 2 days. I was only very young. She brought the same starter culture and the same rennet that we still use today. And that was the start of us making cheese over 40 years ago.
And I'm interested in how these territorial cheeses reflect, as Andy was saying at the beginning, you know, these are cheeses of their place. How does Lancashire reflect Lancashire? How does the cheese reflect the climate, the geography, the history, I don't know, the economics?
It's just one of those. So again, it's one of the territorials, isn't it? And you know, like you were saying, you know, 1938, 39, before the war, there was 220 Lancashire cheesemakers, all making raw milk Lancashires. Just after the war, I think 20 came back into production. Now we're down to 6, and I'm the last one doing a raw milk Lancashire. I don't know what.
Is it so? Because the process for making Lancashire is an interesting one, isn't it? Where you make curd one day, you make curd another.
So
and is that because why is that because of the size of the farm or the geography?
No, it's the old recipe. You know, I mean, Lancashire's been made since the 12th century. You know, there are actually. It was King John that actually granted and gave a royal charter to a cheese fair in Preston back in the 12th century. So cheesemaking goes back, or Lancashire cheesemaking goes back that far. It was only, but Lancashire cheese in those days wouldn't represent what we're making today. It was only more in the 1700s that it would sort of start to represent cheese that you would recognise now, Lancashire cheese. But it was a chap called Joseph Gornall back in 1893. And I quite like this story. He was a chap from Cabus in Garstang, which is about 6 miles from me. And back in 1893, he standardised Lancashire cheesemaking, and it was called the Joseph Gornall Patent to Cheesemakers. And that he's the guy that put sort of acidity levels together, 2-day curd. So he standardised and gave a format of how or what should be used or how you should make Lancashire cheese. And that's basically what, you know, that's what my grandma adhered to and made her through her life. My mum, who's obviously, she's still alive, she's carrying on the same thing, and I'm doing the same thing. So really, when we do say this is farmhouse, this is proper old-fashioned Lancashire, this is a true territorial, we do believe it is, because, you know, we feel we are using that recipe that was, you know, created from Joseph Gornall back in 1893.
It's an Andy, I know you sell a lot of Graham's cheese, don't you? I mean, and I know you sell a lot of Sally's cheese. You've got I mean, we don't want to get into Yorkshire versus Lancashire here, do we?
No. It's
and Lancashire, not too far apart, but they're quite different cheeses. Why are they different? You know,
I mean, there's a couple of things I love about Graham and Graham's cheese. I mean, Graham is the last one making that 2-day curd method that he learnt. Now, all the other factories have sped up the process and made it more efficient. They use more heat and bacteria, and that makes a good, consistent cheese. But Graham's the last one who makes Lancashire as it kind of would have been, and that's part of Britain's social history, I think. And I think that for me, they are very. If you imagine, they're just. I mean, I'm as far away from Sally as I am away from Graham. I'm about 35 miles from each one, really. And they're so distinctly different cheeses, but they're both northern in profile, and they're both real reflections of their place. You go to their place, you taste their milk, and you go, "Oh, that's why it tastes like that," And I think that's a very special thing. And I think that Graham's has this real butteriness, this fluffiness, this sharpness, and Sally's cheese is a special cheese in terms of the way that they farm and they make their cheese. And I think one of the great things about keeping alive these territorial British cheeses and this diversity, that there was 220 producers of Lancashire cheese, is they would have all been different. They wouldn't have been standardized factories that you go, "Oh, I don't know who made this." You'd have tasted it and you've gone, "Oh, this is Graham's cheese." Or you'd have tasted another one, you've gone, made down the road from Graham, and you've gone, "Oh, this is Mrs. Townley's cheese. I know her cheese. I prefer hers, but my mum likes Graham Kirkham's." And I think that's a special thing, that diversity of flavour. And it's a special thing that British territorial cheeses, I think, have a poor reputation. They're not sexy, they're not cool, they're not an oozy soft brie or a creamy rich blue. And I think what you're looking at here with these three cheesemakers is three people who make a true example of British territorial cheeses, and why they gathered that real traditional, that real amazing reputation that they have today is because the flavour just shines through. The final thing that I want to showcase with Graham, really, just before you move on, is that, one of the things I really love about Graham is, and one of the things that I think is key to diversity in cheese, is Graham isn't trying to be cool. He's not a foodie. He's not, he doesn't eat in fancy restaurants. He's not making this cheese because it's economic for his farm. He's not making this cheese because he gets taught to fancy chefs. He's not making this cheese to Zoom things like this. One of the things, this is when I ask Graham why he makes his cheese, and I think this picture kind of showcases it, is because his mum made it. And then before that, his grandma made it. And I think that is, part of Britain's social history, and I think that with these territorial cheeses, there's people recreating tradition like the Clarkes and the Hattans, but people like Graham are keeping alive part of Britain's social history. He's the last one. Don't we need to hang on to him and encourage more to help him and go alongside him, in my opinion? But there you go. Sorry, Patrick, I got
I think that is quite cool, though, what Graham's doing,
Yeah.
It's hard work. It's a lot of hard work.
There's a good question come in, and I don't know if people can. And then Sally, we'll move on to you because the Stonebeck story is just amazing. It's a really interesting one. Is it from someone called Evo Freeman? As cheesemakers are resurrecting forgotten cheeses, what balance are you trying to strike between replicating what has come before you and experimenting with new techniques and production? So, I mean, anyone can come in on this. Is it all about just recreating what happened 100 years ago, or actually are you trying to do your own version of it? I don't know.
I think for us, we've sort of, I feel like we've done the full circle. We've made a very old-fashioned cheese when my mum and my grandma did it. We built this new dairy, and I feel we went more commercial. The cheese was drier. You would recognise it, probably what we would buy more in a supermarket, more of a piercing white, more of a drier style Lancashire. I feel we've turned the clocks back. We've got sort of quite new modern facilities, but we've looked at like old-fashioned recipes. We have a book from that. It was Randolph that came with the cheesemaking book from 1912. And in that, there was this Lancashire cheese recipe. And we read it together. And some of it we related to and some we hadn't. But yet my mum could do, and we showed it her. She said, "Oh, well, do you not remember when we used to do that? And you've stopped doing it." And we're all guilty. We all, build things and new equipment comes and we change, over time you do change. It just happens. So we've kind of recognised that, and I feel we've sort of turned the clock back. We've got sort of modern premises, but we are using really old-fashioned techniques and understanding. I think what it is, we understand more about the cheese making rather than making cheese and you watch the clock on the wall. We kind of understand what each stage is doing, what each stage we're trying to get to when we're doing that stage, and how can we make it better. So I think for us, I think we've blended the old and put it into some of the new, and that's what we've come out with, you know.
So Sally, let's bring you in, because we're talking about old cheese books here. And as I understand it, I mean, you make Stonebeck Wensleydale in Nidderdale, and a bit like the Clarkes, you had to do a lot of research before you launched the cheese and then started making the cheese. Tell us a bit more about that story.
Yeah, so the story of Wensleydale, as Graham was saying, with his cheese, goes back to the 12th century. But for us, for the Wensleydale story, it was the Cistercian monks that came across from France and brought with them their whole sort of cheese tradition and heritage. And they established monasteries in the Yorkshire Dales. And then those sort of practices and customs became part of the local Dales farm heritage. So it became a sort of cultural heritage, and each farm would use some of the milk. You know, subsistence farms had a little bit of everything, use some of that milk and preserve it as cheese for their sort of winter food. And those that then created had surplus cheese started to sell it. And you mentioned all of the sort of challenges that happened during the war and the Depression. So a lot of that farmhouse tradition was lost. And I think it was about 1957, the last known farmhouse Wensleydale cheese. Kit Calvert did an amazing job to keep the more industrial Wensleydale going, but we really lost, a lot of that heritage and tradition. So when we started to want to make a cheese that had some integrity and belonged to the farm, where tenant farms in the Dales, we had to do a lot of looking, and it was fascinating because there's a heritage of cheese making on our farm. We tried to speak to as many people who remembered or were involved in farmhouse cheese making in the area. We interviewed a lady that was 101 who remembered making cheese with her mom. So just like Graham, you know, it was passed through that female line. And really the cheese making fitted round the whole farming day. Where we jokingly call ourselves Team Hattan, but I think it's always been like that. It's always been teamwork on farming. Everyone's had a job and a role to do, and it was that sort of part of that female tradition to do that cheese making. So yeah, we did a lot of reading, looked at some of the old recipes, and went on courses, tried to find that sort of magic that happens between, because it is a wonderful thing, cheese making a sort of liquid thing into this solid, and making some of the tastes that are in that milk really tangible, and you know, using the science that we can apply these days, but trying to find something with integrity that does represent the cultural heritage, the recipe, and represent our farm. Yeah.
And your stories are a little bit about the farm itself. So you're in quite a remote area, aren't you? So you're not on sort of lush pastures. It's quite sort of tough land, isn't it? So, and because I'm interested, we're talking about diversity.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that's quite interesting around, if you go around most dairy farms, you see black and white Holstein Friesian cows, but that's not what you've got, have you? So tell us a bit about the farm itself.
Our farm is fairly wild and woolly, I would say. We're an isolated hill farm. We can't grow anything. We don't grow any crops. We grow grass. And we only make our cheese, again, with looking back and that sort of integrity for the cheese making. We only make cheese, we only milk our cows when they're out eating pasture. And our pasture is unimproved. We don't put any fertilizers on. And over time, we try and work with the geography of our farm and understand the resource that we've got, and work with that. So we've put our meadows into hay restoration projects, which support ground nesting birds, and we've done a lot of woodland work. And we're looking to understand the pasture that those cows are eating, because that's what then translates into the both the texture and the taste of our cheese. And we did some baseline surveys this year. We've got about 80 different species that we can identify in those pastures. So we actually took a lot of, we used to have a lot of sheep on the farm, but we've reduced those numbers, and that allows that pasture to really thrive and come through for the cows to enjoy. And our cows are a native breed cow. So they're a rare breed called Northern Dairy Shorthorns, which they nearly became extinct. Just a few people kept them going, and we've now got a herd. We milk 24 each year, but we've got a herd that's giving them a purpose and a you know, hopefully a raison d'etre for the future. And they're out now, so I'm sure everyone's had a very wet and wild week in terms of weather. And our cows are out. They're sort of short, and they grow a very fluffy coat in the winter to protect themselves. And they are a bit cross with the rain, but they're absolutely fine. And yeah, they're sort of fit for purpose. And in fact, they're a dual purpose cow, and you know, everyone would have had a few of these cows in the farms around us. They're that sort of northern breed. So when we were looking at the cheese making to make our farm sustainable, it was very much a whole farm approach, and that's including looking back at, you know, what were the cows that would have been here, and in looking at the recipe, you know, following as many different elements and parts to make a cheese that try and reinvent what would have been here. Yeah,
I mean, that's real diversity, isn't it, in terms of breed, what's growing in the pasture. Andy, that sort of backs up what you were saying at the beginning, I suppose, about you know, they taste delicious. I love Stonebeck. I love all these cheeses, but behind that deliciousness, there are lots of other sort of stories and reasons for eating them.
Yeah, and when you talk about diversity, you know, most of Britain's farming is fairly conventional, and most of Britain's farmers are doing a brilliant job at producing great food for our table. But most of the green grass of Britain is mostly one type of grass, most of the same type of cow. And that has its place in the world, but the climate is changing and the world is changing, and we need to have diversity within our system. Not everybody needs to do the same. And that's what this kind of cheese making allows, especially with Andrew and Sally's farm up in Nidderdale, is that it's so remote and it's so challenging. You couldn't farm like you would do on the plentiful lands of you know, Herefordshire and down to Somerset and the like. You have to farm in a different way. And what they have is a diversity in the grasses that they grow, a different cow breed. And, you know, 100 years ago, the black and white cow in Britain was not the most popular cow. Their cow breed was. Who's to say in 100 years, things might be different again? And that's why it's important we keep this diversity alive, so that as things change, the climate changes, the world changes, we can adapt. And the more we celebrate this diversity, the more it's not just about the flavor of the food, but people farming in different ways is a positive thing. You know, we can learn from each other and we can adapt. One of the great success stories with Wensleydale, and I think this is a positive thing within the territorial British cheese, along with the Red Leicester. But, you know, when we set up our business 10 years ago, there was not one farm producer of Wensleydale cheese. And that is a cheese which is historic to Britain. It's historic as Lancashire and Leicester. And now there's 3 that make old-fashioned Wensleydale cheeses in the Dales. And they talk to each other and they get on well, and they farm in different ways, and they do different stuff, and they disagree on some stuff and they agree on some stuff. And for me, that's a real positive, is that actually Graham was in some regards lucky that he could learn off his mum. Sally couldn't, but at least now she's got 3 colleagues to talk to. Graham's unlucky is that he doesn't have anybody to talk to anymore to get advice from. You know, well, nobody will talk to him, but that's a different matter. But you know, and I think that the positivity in that diversity is those 3 farmers that are making Wensleydale are farming and making in a different way. And it's not about which is best. It's actually about they can support each other. And for me as a cheesemonger, when people come into our shop, we go, hang on, let's taste 3 of the same cheese, rather than, you know, and I think that actually makes more of a talking about Wensleydale. And you want it in Leicestershire. I want to go to a cheese shop in Leicestershire and taste 2 or 3 different Leicesters and go, actually, I think it would increase knowledge of this cheese in general, and of that particular territorial cheese in general.
Yeah, it's like a rising tide raises all boats, isn't it? That kind of. Well, we've got 5 minutes just to finish up, and people, you know, cheesemakers, jump in if you've got. There's a few questions coming from people. Let's talk about the future. Actually, someone said, what are your specific fears for the future of British cheeses, and what can we do? You know, how can we? You know, what can members of the public do? What can cheesemakers do? What can cheesemongers do to ensure that these territorial traditional cheeses continue to do well and we see more of them? I'll open that up to anyone who wants to jump in.
Well, we'll go back to what we were saying earlier. We need to, before we started, we need to clone Andy. We need more independent shops that think independently, not like supermarkets that encourage the diversity of flavour and variety. Variety is the spice of life. I'll say it again. And you know, the more of Andy there are, if there was another 30 shops like Andy in the country, it would be a better thing.
And then it's something I fully support. You know, I think that, you know, you need that link. You massively need that link between but things like this are a great thing, and talking about it and raising awareness. And everybody who's come on this talk, the easiest way to support farmhouse produce is to eat it.
Yeah.
You know, never mind that just if you eat it, then we can all keep on making it, and I can keep on selling it. We can all keep on talking about it. So
I'm just reeling from the idea of Andy being cloned at the moment. That's following on from this is another question about sort of supermarkets, because some of your cheeses are in. Some of these cheeses are in. You know, you see good territorial cheeses in some supermarkets. Someone's asked, this is Keith Kendrick's asked, do you want to be in supermarkets? Are supermarkets actually part of the answer here? I don't know. What do we think? Because that's a way to get out to a mass market, or actually is it about its specialist independent shops?
I think we want to be in supermarkets if they want to sell and they're interested in selling artisan cheese. If they really just want to use us as a selling point, then no, I don't want to be in there. And I don't think many of them actually take that view.
I sell to booths and Waitrose, and that's the two I feel reasonably comfortable selling to. You know, after that, you know, the big multiples, for me, just like what David's saying, I don't know if there's a cheese knowledge there. I don't know if there's that, there's no tradition for them to sell that style of cheese. It'd be nice if we could build that. Like, I think we would go back to what we said. We just need more Andys, and we need more people going to shops like Andy, where, you know, they can learn, they can taste off a knife, you know, the people, the staff behind the counter know what they're talking about. You know, there's a conversation sparks up between the customer and the cheesemonger, and it all becomes a really nice buying experience. I think that's where us sort of, you know, territorial, you know, raw milk cheese producers, I think that's where we sit really.
I think that the problem with shopping in a shop like mine is it's not convenient and it's not easy. You know, it's a pain in the neck. I always tell the people who work for us, the team, that for people to come and buy from a specialist cheese shop or any specialist food shop is a pain. It's a walk out their way. You can't get everything you want. And I totally understand those barriers. And I think that's where supermarkets have a role to play, is that, you know, if you can get it in there in the right way, and it can be promoted in the right way and sold in the right way, it can work. I think fundamentally a problem in going back to food diversity, sorry, Pat, I'll shut up in a minute, I promise, is that we don't enjoy buying food in the UK. You know, when you go on abroad to France, you go, oh, let's go on the market, let's go have a little bit of fun, let's buy a little bit of food, let's enjoy it, let's go food shopping. It's a fun environment. Whereas in buying food in Britain is a chore. So shops like mine are seen as they're a bit different, you know, but actually day to day, I think that's a fundamental change that we need to people need to view. Actually going out to a specialty food shop or butchers or cheesemongers is a thing to do as an enjoyment, like you would do when you're in France, you know, and I think that's a fundamental problem. But anyways.
Yeah, no, carry on, Andy. I think there's another question coming in about, actually, does it need to come into education in a way? Does how cheese is made, the difference between a block Wensleydale and a farmhouse Wensleydale need to be taught in schools, in food tech, you know, GCSE, that kind of thing?
I mean, my answer is that's where we need to start, is food in general, not just cheese, but that, you know, we need to start educating and sitting down and having meals together, and that is where actually shops like me and more cheese like this will succeed. It's it's not cared for enough.
I think people fundamentally need to understand how food is produced to start with. I think that would be wonderful to move on to that step, but they don't even, not enough food things are taught in school. To start with, it's something that you do all your life, and you feed your stomach all your life, and it's not really it's not taken seriously enough in schools.
I'll never forget this experience. It's going back 20 years when I did the first farmers market. When